Hello, everyone. Welcome. Tonight, it's so nice to see all of you here. I'm so glad it stopped raining, and I didn't have to worry about people staying home because they were going to get wet, so I'm glad to see everyone. I am Judy Greenspan, Director of Public Programs here at the Center for Jewish History. And on behalf of the Center and our partners for tonight's event, the Ackman and Ziff Family Genealogy Institute and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, I'm very pleased to welcome everyone to our program, Searching for Jewish History with Joseph Berger. Tonight's presentation is part of First Person, Jewish Stories, Jewish Lives, a new series here at the Center that seeks to illuminate the broader Jewish experience through individual personal stories. This is not unfamiliar territory to our guest tonight, and we are delighted to have Joseph Berger with us this evening. I imagine that most of us in this auditorium are extremely familiar with Joe's byline in the New York Times. In fact, I'd like to see a show of hands of anyone here who has not read a Joseph Berger story. Okay, I have one. You're in for a treat. A reporter first with Newsday and the New York Post, Joe went on to become a reporter, editor, columnist, and the recipient of numerous journalism awards during his 30-year career at the New York Times. He extensively covered religion and education, and for 3 years he was, quote, a kind of roving correspondent to New York neighborhoods. His interest in the ethnic and cultural richness of the city resulted in numerous feature stories and led to 2 of his books, The World in a City, and the pious ones, The World of Hasidim and Their Battles with America. Joe retired from the Times in 2014, but luckily for his readers, he is still a contributing writer, and his byline continues to signal a special brand of storytelling. Warm, insightful, humorous, and deeply empathetic, Joe has given his readers a treasure trove of wonderful stories over the years, many of which make use of his knowledge of Yiddish, his first language, and focus on the ever-evolving Jewish experience. You may remember some of these pieces. There was the one about the somewhat mystifying yet growing popularity of sushi in the Orthodox world. Headlined, "Enough with the gefilte fish, I'll have sushi," Joe's article began like this: "Gefilte fish, of course. Potato kugel, sure, but sushi? Yes, sushi, which you won't find in most 20th century cookbooks, let alone the Torah, has become a runaway hit in the city's Hasidic and other Orthodox Jewish precincts." He reported on the launch of the Forward newspaper's new Yiddish website. In an article called "Teaching an Old Tongue New Tricks," he wrote, "The fate of Yiddish is something of a question mark, perhaps fitting for a culture famous for answering questions with questions. Its use is popularly believed to be fading as Holocaust survivors and the people who learned Yiddish at the kitchen tables of their immigrant parents die off. But scholars say not to write off Yiddish just yet." Last year, Joe wrote about a stunning discovery in the Jewish world when curators at our partner organization, the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, found out that 170,000 pages of Jewish materials hidden from the Nazis had been located in a church basement in Vilnius. The papers, some of which are now on display in YIVO's rare book room, had been assumed lost and included notebooks of poetry by Chaim Grad, letters by Shalom Aleichem, and a postcard by Marc Chagall. Joe, too, preserves this era of Jewish history, often in the form of the many obituaries, really mini-biographies, that he writes about the luminaries of the 20th century Jewish world. I want to share with you the first paragraph from his obituary about Holocaust survivor and Israeli novelist Aharon Appelfeld, who died earlier this year. Capturing a great deal in just a few words, Joe wrote, "Aharon Appelfeld, the acclaimed Israeli novelist who wrote disturbing, obliquely told stories of self-deluded Jews slowly awakening to the reality of the Holocaust, died on Thursday in Petach Tikva near Tel Aviv. He was 85. Tonight, we're in for a treat. Joe will tell another compelling story, this time his own. It's one he first shared in his beautiful 2001 memoir, Displaced Persons, Growing Up American After the Holocaust, and then expanded on in 2015 when he wrote a piece for The Times about his roots journey back to Poland. Joe and his siblings grew up in the Bronx, the children of Polish Jewish Holocaust survivors. After their parents died, Joe and his sister Evelyn, who we welcome here tonight, as well, embarked on a trip in search of their heritage, a family journey that was both emotional and surprising. Unfortunately, since Joe and Evelyn traveled to Poland, the political climate there and in the world has changed. And so for those of you considering your own roots journeys, would a trip like Joe's be different today? And how is the political climate affecting Jewish life in Poland now? To discuss these questions with Joe, we're very pleased to have two visitors from Poland here tonight, Jonathan Ornstein, the Executive Director of the JCC in Krakow, and Helise Lieberman, the Director of the Taube Center for the Renewal of Jewish Life in Poland and the Taube Jewish Heritage Tours. Jonathan and Helise, whose numerous credentials are more completely listed in your programs, are both American Jews and expats, now living in Poland and devoted to rebuilding a thriving Jewish community. They will join Joe for the second part of our program. And finally, a few words about where we are before we begin. The Center for Jewish History is a world-renowned research institution and home to 5 partner organizations and their truly extraordinary archives. Housed in a 12-story building behind this one, the combined collections of our partners, the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Sephardi Federation, the Leo Baeck Institute, Yeshiva University Museum, and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research are considered to be the world's largest and most comprehensive archive of the modern Jewish experience outside of Israel. Best of all, though, what we have here is accessible to everyone through public programs like this one, academic conferences, concerts, classes, and exhibitions. Our library and genealogy institute are open for research, and without ever leaving home, you can spend hours exploring our partners' digital archives, where you'll find treasures like the photos you were looking at earlier from YIVO's collection. You can pick up more information in the Great Hall about this institution, and we hope you will take advantage of the tremendous resources in this unassuming building on West 16th Street in Manhattan. So there will be a question and answer period with Joe and Jonathan and Helise following their conversation, and a reception with a book signing of Joe's memoir in the Great Hall after the program. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Joseph Berger.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you to the center, which has been a major resource of mine for stories. That the story that Judy mentioned came through YIVO, through YIVO's research. And I've had done stories for involving the museum, the Yeshiva University Museum and the Leo Baeck Institute. So it's a pleasure to be talking here. And secondly, I want to thank Judy for organizing this program and miraculously getting Helise Lieberman to come and Jonathan Ornstein to come from Warsaw and Krakow for this occasion. It's just wonderful. Thanks so much. And you've put so much work into it, so I really appreciate it. I'm going to talk about a trip I took to Poland in 2015 with my sister Evelyn. But before I do, by the way, Poland and Ukraine with my sister Evelyn, and before I do, I want to tell you something about my parents and the world they were part of in New York. They didn't call themselves Holocaust survivors. They called themselves Greener, or refugees, Greener for greenhorn, refugees. In some ways, they were not all that different than refugees today, but there were major differences as well, and I want to talk about that. There were 140,000 of them who came over between 1946 and 1953, and I was always impressed with that number because I always thought of the Greeners as a small little community, but it wasn't that small. It was 140,000 of them, and they were different than other immigrants because they had no place to go back to. they didn't come here seeking opportunity. They didn't come here for the gold in the Medina, for the streets paved with gold. They came here because they really had no place to go back to. Their homes were destroyed. Their villages were destroyed. Jewish life in Poland and in practically every other European country was decimated. My mother, for example, thought about, well, first of all, let me tell you about each of their stories a little bit. My mother fled the Warsaw area when it was under Nazi domination. She had a brother who was a communist sympathizer, and he told her what a great life they could have in Russia. So she followed him, and of course they did not have a great life in Russia. They almost died there. Her brother did die there, but it was better than her having stayed in Poland. My father was in a part of Poland that was taken over by the Russians in that famous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And so he was drafted into the Russian army, and that saved his life as well. So they wanted to go back to Poland, to their homes, but there was nothing to go back to. They stayed in Poland for about for a few months, and then they heard about a pogrom in Kielce. 42 Jews were killed for some false rumor. And so my father said, "We're getting out of here." And they hocked all their belongings and paid a smuggler to take them over to the DP camps in Germany. And they went to Berlin, to a DP camp in Berlin, where my brother was born. Stories like this were not all that different than many of the other survivors, many of which, obviously, of whom had actually been in concentration camps. But this group began knitting together in the DP camps. They spent 3 or 4 years there, having trouble getting visas to the United States. And this is actually a very shameful chapter of American history. You would think that after the United States did not open its doors widely to the imperiled Jews in 1939, 1940, 1941, that they would have said, you know, we goofed. We should have let more people in. Well, that's not what happened. There was a debate in Congress that went on for several years. That debate was tinged with xenophobia and anti-Semitism. It wasn't really until 1948 that the doors were opened partly, and not until 1950 that the doors for these survivors, Holocaust survivors, were opened fairly widely so that many could come in. But they had began knitting together in those DP camps, the 3 or 4 years that they spent there, or sometimes 7 years. And they didn't wait idly. My friend Sam Norwich, who's here, did a wonderful talk once about what happened in those DP camps. They built schools. They built synagogues. They had opera clubs. They had boxing clubs. Those skeletons that came out of the concentration camps printed 70 newspapers in various DP camps. They also found mates for themselves, not always for romantic reasons. I remember when I was growing up, something I would hear occasionally was, Hitler hat gemacht Schidduch, which was a way of saying, you know, this couple was maybe a little mismatched sociologically, economically, but that's what happened during in that period. Now, when they came to America, they lived in these fairly seedy hotels at first. Some of those are now multi-million-dollar co-ops, like the Whitehall and the Marseille and on the Upper West Side. My parents ended up in the Capitol Hall, and they took these jobs often I was always impressed by the fact that so many had the same jobs, sewing dresses, operating laundromats, upholsterers, peddling, operating luncheonettes. Why that kind of work? You didn't have to speak English, is the main reason. My father worked as a foreman in a factory that made ironing board covers. My mother sewed hats down on Astor Place, and they had these customs that were different than other Americans. For example, when I bumped my head, my father didn't put ice on the bump. You know, he wasn't accustomed to refrigerators. I don't even know if we had a refrigerator at first. They used a kalte Messer, a cold knife, to press it in. And if I had an earache, he put a compress that he made out of a sock, which we must have had a sock for this occasion, filled with some groats that he heated up in a frying pan and put against my ear. Maybe that's why I don't hear so well today. Anyway, the children growing up with them were very aware of the differences. These folks spoke Yiddish. They had different kind of dental, work, gold teeth, for example. They ate strange foods like gala, or pichai, as it's sometimes called. The children grew up with their fathers who didn't know baseball. They were not comfortable eating pizza. And they really stumbled. One of the stories I tell in my memoir is about my coming home and telling my mother, I'm going to be playing George Washington in a play, the story about his chopping down the cherry tree and telling his parents, I can't lie, it was me. So I told my mother was, got very nervous about this whole thing. What did she know about George Washington? And I told her, well, he was a general. So she went out to a used clothing store and bought me a GI outfit, which she sewed to my size. I remember my father once got into an argument with a bus driver on the way to Orchard Beach. And he came up with the worst curse he could think of. He called him you son of a gun. And I tell these stories because as anxious and uncertain and as haunted as they were, there was also a lot of life. I remember my parents getting together with these friends, all of whom had lost their families, and laughing a lot. And in fact, I want to say that their story really is a fairly triumphant story, because you think, having gone through what they do, that they might have ended up sad and depressed constantly. In fact, they lived sturdy lives. They entered the middle class. They raised children who became professionals. They had grandchildren and great-grandchildren. My brother is a dermatologist. My sister's a psychoanalyst. Yesterday, we went to the graduation of my nephew, Jakey, who is now a doctor. Graduated from Columbia Medical School. And today, my other nephew, my brother's son, is graduating from medical school in Israel. So, and if you need some famous names, Sam Norwich, who was publisher of the Forward, Andrew Grove, who founded Intel, Max Frankel, who was executive editor of the New York Times, Daniel Libeskind, who did the design for the New World Trade Center, Hadassah Lieberman, Wolf Blitzer of CNN, who's a relative of my friend Simon, who's here, Jerry Zaks, who's directed Hello, Dolly, is a Holocaust survivor's kid. And my mother, who didn't know who George Washington was, at the age of 70, she graduated Hunter College. So this will give you a sense of who these people were. Okay, well, I had talked to my parents about returning to Poland, and my father never wanted to. He was very embittered about his whole experience. My mother eventually thought it kind of felt pulled to take a look at her town of Otwock. And she used to talk about this town of Otwock, and she made it sound like Brigadoon. It had lilac trees, it had the air, the Luft, you know, I mean, no Luft could compare to the Luft of Otwock. So there was a certain pull to go back. But unfortunately, my father had a stroke. When they were ready to go, my father had a stroke. He died in 2003. My mother soon after developed Alzheimer's, and she died in 2009. So, you know, it took us a while to really think about going. And by the way, interestingly, when she was sick, she was taken care of by a Polish woman. And I'm going to show you, first of all, let me show you a picture of my folks. There they are. This I think, was taken in the DP camp in, I'm guessing it was Landsberg. My father, my mother, that's my little brother Josh. My sister wasn't born yet. She was born in the Bronx, 12 years after me. Anyway, my mother was taken care of by a Polish woman who I hired because I figured with Alzheimer's, she's going to lose her English, and it's hard to find a Yiddish-speaking person to take care of her. So I figured we could find somebody who was Polish. And she did marvelously, took marvelous care of her. And I think that alone made me want to, I think, made it more comfortable for me to want to go back to Poland. I wanted to see Otwock. I'd done a lot of traveling. There was no place I wanted to necessarily go to. My wife, Brenda Berger, had to go for a trip to Australia for a nephew's daughter's bat mitzvah. So I had some time, and we planned it simultaneously. And so my sister and I went there, and she persuaded me not only to go to Otwock, which is just what I wanted to see, and Warsaw, but she persuaded me to also include my father's town, which is now in Ukraine, the town of Boronia. And, you know, my mother used to make fun of my father's town because she came from Otwock. In fact, she claims that in my book, and I don't remember this, she claims I called Otwock a shtetl. She was insulted by that. My father lived in a shtetl. That was a shtetl, a peasant village. Anyway, so we flew to Warsaw, my sister and I, which was largely destroyed by the Nazi blitzkrieg and then by the Soviet retaking of the city. And we hired a guide from, and I mention this because some of you may want to take trips like this, from the Taube Jewish Heritage Tours, founded by a man named Tad Taube, who's an immigrant from Poland who has spent a lot of money to help revive the Jewish community in Poland. Now, we landed in Warsaw, and the first person we went to see was my mother's babysitter. I call it babysitter. The woman who took care of my mother. That's Maria Bukowska over there. And that's my sister and I. And they wanted to spend an enormous amount of time with us, and we ended up having dinner 3 times, and it was wonderful. You know, Maria speaks this English, that pidgin English, like, speak Maria. You know, she calls up and she says, speak Maria. That means she's on the phone. Anyway, her son was there, and her son spoke English, and he could translate a lot of what we had to say. So we spent some time going around Warsaw with with Maria Bukowska, and seeing Poland, seeing Warsaw was important because my mother, coming from a poor background, was sent there at 14 years old to work. Now, she's Otwock, which is about a 30-minute train ride from Warsaw. She left her home in Otwock and went to live with an aunt in Warsaw. Things didn't work out with the aunt, and pretty soon my mother was alone, on her own, and she was on her own for the next 5 years until the war broke out. After some hard years, she achieved a sense of independence. She managed to take in Warsaw's sophisticated cultural life, movie theaters. She used to talk about seeing Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. She went to writers' clubs. For all I know, she ran into Isaac Bashevis Singer, political clubs, and she really relished that city. So my sister and I tried to visit some of the addresses she mentioned. My mother, toward the end of her life, wrote a journal about her life, a memoir of her own, and I actually include excerpts from it in my memoir. So we had some actual addresses, and it turned out that almost all those places were gone. There was no more Yiddish theater, the Nowosky Yiddish Theater. No more writers' clubs. The house. The house she had stayed in was gone. When the war broke out on September 1st, 1939, my mother was sitting in a coffee shop and heard that bombs had been dropped on Otwock. The first bomb, apparently, that the Nazis dropped hit Otwock, according to my mother. Her brother, and then pretty soon they bombed Warsaw mercilessly. And she took her brother's advice. His advice was, don't stay in shelters, because if they're in a building, it could collapse when it's hit by a bomb. So they spent the next few days walking in parks, Krasinski Park, Saxon Gardens. So we visited those parks. My mother, when she walked there with her brother, saw dead soldiers, dead people, and dead horses. She described particularly the carcasses of horses. Obviously, when we visited it, the lilacs were in bloom. What a nice coincidence. But, you know, it looked like a park. There were ducks paddling, lovers kissing. There was no sense that this had been a site of such destruction. And my mother, in her memoir, described that she and her brother walked into the marketplace, which was completely abandoned, and all the food had been stripped, but they found a bag of prunes, a big sack of prunes, and those prunes kept her alive for the next few weeks. And the marketplace was Zalesny Bramy. And so we went to the marketplace. It's still there. And it's a thriving marketplace. It moved a bit, not too far, but there it is, the same Zalesny Bramy. Forgive my Polish pronunciation. It was bustling with shoppers and goods. My mother stayed in an aunt's house at 26 Franciscanka Street. We went there. 18 Franciscanka Street. Sorry, wrong number. You know, the building is there, but it's clearly not the same. I think it's been replaced by a newer building. But we did get our first, on those early tours that my sister and I took, we did get our first taste of a new Poland because many non-Jews were working to help the revival of Jewish life. There were non-Jews working in the genealogy office, which we went to. They were working as guides for Jewish tourists, and incredibly knowledgeable, and knowledgeable about Jewish customs and Jewish history. So it was very impressive that they would choose to do this, and I think there was a sincere need, a sincere desire to find out more about this community of 3.5 million people who had been such a major part of Polish culture and Polish history. People like Paweł Lukasiewicz, am I pronouncing it correct? Close, okay. Anna Drozd. We also got a strong sense of a very heartening trend, the effort to rebuild the Jewish community of Poland. And strangely enough, it's being led by a group of New Yorkers. Helise Lieberman, who was living on the West Side but when she took the job in Warsaw, has started a school, a Jewish school. Half the students are not Jewish, but they feel like they're going to get a better education there. 240 students. The chief rabbi of Poland, which is a rather inflated title, since there aren't all that many rabbis in Poland to begin with. Michael Shudrick is another West Sider. And he holds services Friday night at one of the very few synagogues that are left in Warsaw, the Nożyk Synagogue. And there were about 100 people there when we went for services. I guess it was on was it Friday night? Friday night services. And afterwards we had dinner at his at the synagogue, and there were several people there who had recently discovered their Jewish roots. Now, they grew up as Gentiles, but at some point, a grandmother told them, you're really Jewish. You were left by a Jewish family that didn't come back after the war. But I raised you as my own. And so there are many stories like this, and that was rather moving. Then Helise Lieberman, who's here and will be up in a minute, gave us a tour of the Warsaw Ghetto. That's is that the remnant of the wall, or is that that's the last remnant of the wall? Yeah, I think that's what it is. And but most of the ghetto has been destroyed, but they've outlined it in stones that you can see as you walk through Warsaw, through that certain area of Warsaw. And of course, the most moving place was the Umschlagplatz. 300,000 Jews were shipped from the railroad terminal. The Umschlagplatz was the gathering place near the railroad terminal, from which they left for places like Treblinka. It says Umschlagplatz. There's my sister there. It's a very moving sight. Along this path of suffering and death, over 300 Jews were driven in 1942 from the Warsaw Ghetto to the gas chambers of the Nazi extermination camps. We also saw some of the markers that are still there. This is a marker that pays tribute to the fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto who fought with a few pistols and Molotov cocktails against and held the Germans off for several days. There's an older monument for the same purpose And then we went to Otwock. And we looked for the addresses of, that my mother gave us of where her home was. The house was on Lezhna Street, 17 Lezhna Street. And we never found the precise address, but we found Lezhna Street, and we found numbers to one side and numbers to the other side, and no number 17 directly. But the area where it would have been, where my mother's house, where she lived with her father and several siblings. She had 8 siblings, all of whom, with one exception, except for one brother, were killed in the war. That house is now a residence for priests, for retired priests. One of the more interesting things about Otwock is there's a museum that was started by a non-Jewish Pole, and it's about the history of Otwock, but he's dedicated an entire room, a large room, to the Jewish culture of Otwock. This was a place that had about 20,000 people, and 10,000 of them were Jews, and they were Jewish doctors and Jewish lawyers and rabbis. It was a big resort for Hasidim would come there. The Gera Hasid had his summer place there. The Lubavitch Hasidim would come there in the summer as well. So it was a large Jew, and he had this man who started the museum, Sebastian. I have his name here somewhere. Sebastian Rakowski. He told me. I said to him, "Why do you spend so much time on collecting Jewish artifacts?" And by the way he collects the Jewish artifacts is, he said, when anybody renovates their home, he asks them if you find anything hidden in the attic, or in the walls, or in the cellars. And people have found a kittel, a white robe you wear on Yom Kippur, prayer books, and he has all that there. This is a plate, a Nazi plate, but he also has photographs of life in Otwock, and there you can see the Hasidic little boy pumping water. And I asked him, I said, "Why are you spending all this time, Sebastian, and energy on collecting Jewish artifacts?" And he said he could not allow Jews to disappear from the town's collective memory. He told me that his mother was born in 1944, toward the end of the war, and did not know there were Jews in Otwock. So he felt that this was his obligation. That was very moving to me. We went to a bakery, the address of a bakery. My mother talked about when she graduated 7th grade, which was the last grade she went to in Otwock. They treated them to a pastry from a certain bakery. And we went to that address. And of course, the building is still there, but there's no bakery. And my mother also talked about the train station in Otwock. And that's there. The train station is there. The story she told was that after the war, she went back to Warsaw in 1946 when the Russians allowed all the Polish refugees to go back to repatriate. She went to Otwock. She went to the train station. She got off at the train. She was in Warsaw, but she went to Otwock. She went to the train station, And there was someone there who she got into a conversation with, and he told her, there are no Jews left in Otwock. She never left the train station, never looked for her home address. But we went to visit the train station. There's my sister, and the train station looks exactly as it did in 1945, leaving the train station. The one Jewish presence that you really feel is in the graveyard. And you can see there's a grave for a man named Steinberg, but you can see it's not very well taken care of. The graves are higgledy-piggledy. We knew that my mother's mother, who died of tuberculosis when she was a young girl, was probably buried there. We don't know for a fact, but we guess she must have been buried in that cemetery. So my sister and I spent a couple of hours looking for a gravestone. We never found it. And I'm sure many of these gravestones were then used to pave the roads as they were typically done. So after we left Otwock, we crossed the Bug River. My mother always talked about the Bug River because she smuggled her way with her brother, the communist sympathizer, across the Bug River to Soviet territory. This was in Poland, but it was occupied by the Soviets. So there was the Bug River. It actually existed. And then we went to Treblinka. And Treblinka is a difficult sight to see. There's no camp there anymore because the Nazis destroyed all the evidence. But what there is a large monument, and there are stones that represent each town where Jews were killed. Mordy was the town my mother's Golan family, she always talked about the family like it was royalty, originated from. And there was a stone for Otwock. We found that. And there's my sister touching the stone. We said Kaddish at the stone. And like I said, Treblinka is just it looks like Stonehenge, if I had to make a comparison. But we did see, my sister and I did visit an actual concentration camp. And that was, of course, Auschwitz. When we got to Krakow, which was the next big city we went to. I'm just looking at my notes here. 900,000 Jews were killed in Treblinka. But Auschwitz is a demonic place. Yes, there's the sign, Arbeit macht frei, and a lot of tourists, but it's very hard to see how industrialized the slaughter of Jews was. How could people actually think about this kind of systematic way to kill people? That somebody actually came up with this idea. My sister used the imagination that could think of the way they went about killing people. And you see that very clearly. Those are the barracks where Jews were kept sometimes they worked, but those who were not fit for work were immediately killed off. Those were the kinds of bunks they had there. That's a gas chamber. You can see all that in Auschwitz. And these are photographs of some of the people who were killed in Auschwitz. But then you see these rooms where the Nazis, the SS, the Germans, collected suitcases. And the names of the people are still on the suitcases. They collected shoes. Is that shoes? I think those are shoes. A whole room of shoes. They collected prosthetic legs. I mean, what were they thinking? Crutches, prosthetic legs. So it was just hard to be in this place. And then as I said, we went to Krakow. And I'll talk a little bit about Krakow in a minute, but I first want to tell you about our visit to my father's town of Boronia. Now, Poland today is a quite modern city, a modern country. Warsaw, for example, is a very sophisticated place. It has lovely cafes where and restaurants where you eat, and there's someone plays Chopin. You really feel, a sense of the old European, Middle European culture that must have thrived there. Not in Ukraine. Ukraine is, the parts that we saw were very primitive. It took us several hours to navigate what should have taken about an hour to go from the border to my father's hometown of Boronia. The roads are rutted. There's still outhouses everywhere, ramshackle bungalows. When we got to Boronia, we had to go to the bathroom. We saw the big church. We figured they'd have a nice bathroom. No, they have an outhouse there too. One thing that we first, when we saw Boronia, it's in the Carpathian Mountains, and the area is a very beautiful area. My father, who was, unlike my mother, who talked a lot about Otwock, my father never talked about his town or his sisters. He had 6 of them. And he never talked about how beautiful the area was that he grew up in. But people there in Boronia, and by the way, this is my sister and I arriving in Boronia. If you see we're kind of laughing because, as I said, my mother used to make fun of this peasant village. So that fact that it actually existed and was kind of a subject of humor for us. So that's my sister and I. The sign says Boronia in Ukrainian. We had a Ukrainian-speaking tour guide named Alex Denisenko, who's terrific, and he does genealogical research for you. Also very familiar with the history of Jews in Poland. So these are some of the houses that's still in Boronia. Women still use scythes. And by the way, this may be an odd observation. I have no way of proving whether it's true, but it seemed to me that the women did all the work. And the men sat around and smoked cigarettes all day. That was our impression. And also, whenever we talked to somebody, it was always the women who did all the talking. Now, my father was a fairly quiet man. Didn't have, he'd always say a piece of wisdom, but he didn't talk much. And I always thought that was something to do with his shyness. It may just have been cultural. In any case, we met this woman here, took us to her grandmother. That's her grandmother. And her grandmother was 11 years old during the war, when the Nazis were in Boronia in 1942, I think it was. Her mouth is closed, but she had like 3 teeth in her whole mouth. She was 86 years old, and she remembered Jewish families, the Stulbachs, the Liebermans, and yes, she remembered Bergers. She told us one Berger owned a tavern, another Berger operated a sawmill. These could have been my father's uncles, is what I'm guessing. But we don't know for sure, and the genealogical search we did was very minimal. The genealogical evidence that we were able to come up with was very minimal. But our guide did send us a business directory. Alex did send us a business directory from Boronia for 1938, I think it was. And sure enough, it listed Berger as owning a tavern and another Berger as owning a sawmill. That was the site of where my father was bar mitzvahed. It's now a evangelical church. And this grandmother described what she saw, what she remembered when the Germans were there. She told us that they beat up women, they shot them, and then they took groups of Jews to a wooded area and shot them there, a whole group. And another woman said, I can show you the site. So we trekked up this hill for about 20 minutes across a stream. We kind of followed the path of a stream, and our shoes got wet. But we went there. The woman said, in that field, the Jews were killed. We did not linger, and we didn't explore anymore. My father, we left Boronia. We only spent a long afternoon there because we needed to get home, and we knew it would take several hours. But on the way back, we went to the big town that my father would sometimes go to, and where he would have gone if he had gone to high school. And it had several. The town is called Turka, and had several synagogues. One is being used as a sawmill now, and the other one is being used as an auto repair shop. So that gives you a sense of what's happened to Jewish life. But we also saw some dazzling synagogues, one in Landshut. That is not Landshut, but let's see if I can find the picture there. No, that's not it. I think it's out. Here it is. Again, the Poles have set up several synagogues for tourists to see, and they actually have guides to take you around the synagogue and tell you the history. That's Landshut. And the guide there, again, another Gentile, spoke Hebrew. He taught himself Hebrew. Another sign of this, of what I tried to talk about before. It's a beautiful synagogue with a Baroque bima. And I remember I talked Hebrew to the guide, and he tells me, the Hasidim tell me I have a Yiddish soul. We then went to Krakow, and Krakow probably has the best sense of remaining Jewish life. It has a Jewish community center. It has some active synagogues. It has a street where you can get gefilte fish and matzahs and simmis and all kinds of dishes year-round. They have in front of several of these restaurants, they play Yiddish music. Ukrainians, the players are not Jewish. They're Ukrainians who've taught themselves Jewish melodies. So, we heard, often Pripyat and many of the great standards. The one about the cigarette seller. I'm blanking out on the name in Yiddish. Exactly. Thank you. So it's a place where you really get a sense of Jewish life there. And of course, it has a Jewish community center run by Jonathan Ornstein, who's here, and it has 700 members. And that is a real evidence of the revival of Jewish life there. And it was very, while we were there, we were fortunate because one day they had a bicycle ride from Auschwitz to Krakow, 50 miles. And one of the riders, and I think this was called the Ride of the Living, am I right? The Ride of the Living. 80 people participated in this ride from Auschwitz to Krakow, and one of them was a man in his 80s named Marcel Zelinsky. He was 10 years old when he was liberated from Auschwitz, and he walked to Krakow. He now lives in Montreal, and he was there with his son. That's Marcel, that's his son. Sorry. That's Marcel, that's his son. I guess those must be his granddaughters. And he biked, 80 years old, biked from Auschwitz to Krakow. And we were there, my sister and I were there at the JCC to watch him finish this ride. And that was very, very moving. I would encourage all of you to make a trip like we did, because as emotional as it can be, it's also very fulfilling, and it also is something that you feel like you need to do before, your life is over. And so I would certainly encourage all of you to do that. I'd like to call up Helise and Jonathan. And I want to say this, that I don't want to be Pollyannish, because I'm sure all of you have heard about the recent legislation that's been passed in Poland, the return of a nationalist government. All of that is worrying, and we're going to talk to Helise and Jonathan about this. This is Helise Lieberman, who founded the Jewish school in Warsaw. And this is Jonathan, who runs the Jewish Community Center in Krakow. So let me ask you this. Given what's happened in recent months in terms of the election and the bills that were passed in the wake, and the march that was held, I guess it was in November, where some people actually displayed Nazi insignia and made anti-Semitic shouts. What's your understanding of the future of the Jewish community?
First of all, Joe, thank you. And thank you for taking all of us on your journey. And I would start by saying that I want to thank you for inviting me and inviting my friend and colleague Jonathan. And I'm about to meet a cousin I've never met. So if you talk about the Center for Jewish History, it does touch us all, so thank you. I would say the following. I believe in Emunah Shlema, in perfect faith. I'm very optimistic about the future of the Jewish community in Poland, and I'm very optimistic about the future of Jews who are Polish Jews. It may sound counterintuitive, I would say, and we talk about this a lot in terms of where do we spend most of our time, and most of our conversation is how do we best strengthen Jewish life in Poland. I've been privileged to be part of this, I don't know if we want to say renaissance, reemergence, revitalization of the Polish Jewish community. I arrived first in 1991. And as the director of the day school, I had an opportunity to see it from the eyes of the younger generation, but also of the older generation and the middle generation, for whom a Jewish education had never looked like it would ever be in the cards. If you had asked them, I think in '88, can you imagine sending your child or your grandchild to a Jewish school? they would never have said yes. So I would say, given the fact that we are now a community, small, but we're communities with institutions that we all know that we rely on, whether we use them or not. We have several different kinds of synagogues where people go to, and then they don't go to one of them, so that's feeling a little bit like we're out in the world. We have amazing JCC in Krakow, a JCC in Warsaw, Hillel, Warsaw, Hillel, Krakow, and the list goes on and on. So I would say when you inaugurate new programs and new institutions almost on an annual basis, you can't help but feel hopeful.
Jonathan?
Thank you. Thank you for talking about your journey. Joe, it was great meeting you there. Nice to see you here again, and thank you to the Center for Jewish History. Thank you all for coming out to hear about Poland. I agree with Helise. I'm incredibly optimistic about our future. I think the way to look at it is to take a couple steps back and realize that from 1989 until 2017, there was almost 30 years of absolute rocket ship, uninterrupted growth, and the community developed institutions, synagogues, young people are finding out they're Jewish, we're rebuilding Jewish infrastructure, and then a few bumps in the road like we've had lately in terms of a government that, I should say, I don't think the government is anti-Semitic. I think that there are populist elements of the government, and it's a little more complicated than it sometimes seems. But the community, I think, is strong enough to weather this bit of troubled time, and we're moving forward. I think we as a community continue to be optimistic. I think something worth pointing out is that this tremendous rebirth of Jewish life is not a government program. This wasn't something instituted by the government. This is very much grassroots, from the bottom up. And Joe touched upon something very interesting, which is the amount of non-Jewish interest and cooperation in Poland. And that's something that young people feel that the country lost something when it lost its Jews, when the Jews were murdered and kicked out and driven underground, and they have an opportunity not only to learn about this almost vanished minority, but to actually help work hand in hand with this small but growing Jewish community to rebuild these institutions and rebuild Jewish life. So in our JCC, which is an order of magnitude smaller than JCC Manhattan or 92nd Street Y or 14th Street or any of these great JCCs we have in New York, we have 55 non-Jewish volunteers, which is something quite amazing. So to talk about non-Jewish Poles working in Jewish institutions is one thing, and we might cynically say, oh, they're working, it's a job. Okay. I wouldn't be so cynical, even as a New Yorker, but there are volunteers, young people across the country who are helping us and giving their time and effort and expertise helping the Jewish community rebuild. So I think that Poland continues to be a good place to be Jewish. It continues to be a safe place, and I think there's very few easier places in Europe to be Jewish today than Poland, especially Krakow.
How has the developments affected the numbers of Jews returning to Poland? By the way, one of the people I wanted to introduce who has made a similar journey, except he went back to Buchenwald, where he was born. My friend Simon Herling, who's in the third row over there, one of the few children actually born in a concentration camp, a labor camp, but he was born and survived, was not immediately killed. Yeah. So I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
You're asking about Jews.
Are Jews returning now to?
So when we talk about growth in the Jewish community, we're not really talking about Jews returning. We're talking about young people who are finding out that they're Jewish, who grew up in Poland, grew up Catholic, and somewhere along the way found out that they were Jewish, and that's still happening. I should also point out that there are a lot of friends here in the audience tonight, but there are two people here who found out they're Jewish and have very, very interesting stories, one of whom is in the front row, Katka Reshke, who wrote a fantastic book about her experience finding out that she's Jewish and being involved, and also my wife, Kasha, who's there in the back, who found out she was Jewish in the 20s. In her 20s, her sister, not in the 20s, she'd be at a beach. I'll get in trouble. In her 20s, was brought to the JCC by her sister, who was very involved. Kasha wasn't that excited about it, and then we met at the JCC, and she got a little more interested, and we were married in front of the JCC this past year. So it still is happening. It's still, young people are still finding out they're Jewish, and I think that, but it's important to make the distinction to say that if the environment changes or continues to go in a bad direction, if that's the direction we think it's going, and I don't think it's necessarily going in a bad direction, it has gone. I think things are on the way getting better. But if there's not a positive environment for people to act upon finding out they're being Jewish, then this revival is in trouble. So to find out you're Jewish, have a Jewish grandparent, parent, whatever, in sometimes very dramatic way. To find out you're Jewish is one thing, but you need to act on it. And the reason that these young people are finding out and that find out they're Jewish, the reason they're acting upon it, they're acting on it because the environment is one that's conducive to being Jewish. And if that environment changes, then those people will stay in the closet, so to speak, and that's the worry.
I would say, too, that in addition to having institutions, and for those of us who've been there a long time, we're watching a generation of Jews, Polish Jews, however they define themselves, who have grown up with these institutions. And the institutions which were seated with the generosity of people like Ronald Lauder, certainly the chairman of the Taube Foundation, Tad, are now making decisions about what does it mean to be a Polish Jew and what will those institutions look like. So in addition to people feeling that they are connected or choose to connect or choose to learn more, you've got a new face of Polish Jewry, which is also very much part of, and I would say this, and I think we would all agree, we're no longer in the revival stage. We're moving forward towards growth and strengthening what we have.
Tell us about the genealogical, for people who might want to take such a trip. Tell us about what they might find out about their genealogy in visiting the Jewish Community Center and Warsaw.
So I would just start that I know someone who, actually my former husband, is the founder of the center, which is called the Jewish Genealogy and Family Heritage Center in Warsaw. And having been married to a genealogist, I sort of had this idea that there were people looking for leaves on trees. And it didn't really hit me how important it is for all of us to find out where we come from, who we are, who we might be connected to, and what kind of, and I'm not talking about chemical or whatever DNA, but what kind of, our neshama comes from somewhere. And I think that what I've learned traveling with you, working with your sister, and other people that we've had the privilege of touring and journeying with, is that it's really a search for information, but also confirmation. And so we would invite people to come to the Jewish Genealogy Center in Warsaw. It's housed in the Jewish Historical Institute. And that's where you can help further that's one of the places you can help further your journey. It can start at your computer at home. It can start here at the Center for Jewish History, using all of the resources that are here in this building and people who are also incredible resources. And the other piece that I've learned is you always find something.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Jonathan?
So our JCC, I think, is probably unique in the Jewish world as a JCC that has a genealogist on staff, which I think speaks to two truths. One is young people are finding out that they have Jewish roots or suspect that they have Jewish roots, and we're helping to bring them back in. And the other is the amount of visitors that are coming. So our center, which is small JCC, hosted 125,000 visitors in 2017, many of whom are looking to make that connection to their past and learn about their Polish roots. Very often people come in, some people know a lot about their history, some people know and say, oh, my grandfather, I think, we called him Moish, and I think he's from, somewhere in Poland. we get the whole spectrum. So
I'm from Galicia. You from Galicia? We must be neighbors.
Exactly. So Poland today is a very easy country to be a tourist in. Krakow, the number is 13 million tourists visited last year. So it's a phenomenally easy place. Warsaw, especially the big cities, Warsaw and Krakow, are very easy to visit, and then easy. Certainly, the facilities are there in Warsaw and Krakow to connect people to their background.
Well, it was interesting. Before we left, my sister was actually a little nervous about going to Poland because she'd had this. Her parents talk about it. Before we left for Poland and Ukraine, my sister was actually quite nervous about this trip because she had this history of listening to my mother and father talk about the anti-Semitism they experienced on a regular basis, and of course and the war stories themselves, and yet once we were there, it just felt enormously comfortable. Is that the experience most people have when they?
Yeah, no, people are very surprised. I think that, I should tell you, once a week somebody comes into my office and they say, I was so surprised, I landed in the Krakow airport and the Coca-Cola sign was in red. In other words, our vision of Poland when we close our eyes is so completely black and white and gray, and it surprises us when Poland is a normal country, because for most Jews, Poland is not a normal country. There's so much history. And it's almost exclusively been defined lately by a traumatic 20th century. So people are very shocked when they come and they see it's a country, a modern country in Warsaw with skyscrapers, and Krakow with old world charm, and people are certainly shocked.
And I would be remiss not to mention that in Warsaw there's a wonderful, wonderful museum called the Poland Museum that was built not that long ago.
It opened in 2014.
2014, and it traces the 900-year history of Jews in Poland, and it's riveting. And actually, we wanted to spend one day there. We went back for a second day because it's just so rich with exhibits and materials that you can't see it all in one day. So it's and then of course in Krakow there is Schindler's List. Schindler's Factory is there, and there's a wonderful museum about the Jews of Galicia. There are other sites. Some of it is kitsch, I warn you, but some of it is just very authentic and wonderful.
I just wanted to come back to Evelyn's concern, if we're pointing you out. And I think this is a very common and healthy concern. And all of us try very hard in the work that we do. Your journey becomes our journey. And we may be the driver, we may be the guide, we just may be the person who meets you at the airport, or my favorite thing is having coffee with people just to say hello, partly because I'm a coffeeholic, but partly it's just nice to have a conversation. And I think that part of it is that no matter whether you're in Krakow or Warsaw or Łódź or in Wrocław or in Lublin, or if you're any place of all of the zillion places that Jews might have come from in between, you should know that we all take care of you. We have a network of guides and partners, among them the JCC, where there's a sort of a net that sort of goes with you.
By the way, I have a question that I hadn't thought of before, and it's really something I want to know. You spend much of your lives now in Poland. What made you decide to do that? I mean, some people might consider that an enormous sacrifice. What drove you to do that?
Sacrifice, I'd say it's a privilege. I feel like I live in the most beautiful city in the world, in Krakow. You mentioned, a little bit of the kitsch. Krakow has the best preserved Jewish quarter anywhere in the world, right? None of this talk about Venice and Prague. We have 7 renovated pre-war synagogues. The youngest is from 1862. The oldest is from the 15th century. You can leave the JCC by walking and go to all 7 and be back in our building in 10 minutes. So there's really a unique amount of Jewish heritage going on. And I just wanted to maybe touch, my story. I can tell how I got there. I don't think it's that It's a little strange, but it's not so exciting compared to talking about the revival going on. But there's a healing going on, and I think it's important for us as Jews. This is the place. Israel is our homeland from thousands of years ago, but the place where we became the Jewish people is Poland. And I think it's unhealthy for us as a people to be cut off from the place where our ancestors lived, our families lived for generation and generation, for 1,000 years. It's not good for us. There's a disconnect, and we all understand why that's the case, and it's so hard to see Poland past the Holocaust and past the difficult 20th century, but I think it behooves us to do that, because this is where we became the Jewish people, and we can't lose our connection to that.
What drove you to devote so much of your life to Poland?
There's a couple friends and some family in the audience who've been asking me that question since we packed up in 1994 and put things in storage for 2 years. Actually, my interest in Poland, again, my former husband was a student at Columbia University, Polish, Russian, Hebrew, Yiddish. And I remember in the 80s, he had a T-shirt, and emboldened on the T-shirt in red was Solidarność. And I said, nice, nice. No connection. But we were invited by Michael Schudrick, who is now the chief rabbi of Poland and then worked for the Ronald Lauder Foundation. They had started a series of winter and summer retreats in the very beginning, already in 88, 89, when people were beginning to feel that they could talk about who they were or find out more. And they had a retreat in a place called Żywiec, which is near not far from Krakow. And we got there because Rabbi Schudrick had asked me to run a Shabbat meal for the children of the Holocaust, and I was ignorant, and I'm not proud, but I had no idea the people whom I was about to serve. These were people who had grown up from all over the world, but primarily Poland, who had been hidden as children, raised as non-Jews, and here they were for the first time in 1991 in New York at a conference for hidden children. I went, I said to Michael, now you owe me, or please pay. And he took us to camp, and there was a very compelling story, and it wasn't a story, it was many stories. And when I was given the opportunity to help Ronald Lauder open the school, I had two other options, Westchester and Washington. And Warsaw was the first alphabetically. So, I don't regret it.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'd like to open the floor to some questions.
Hi, thank you for telling us about your journey and talking about Krakow and Warsaw so compellingly.
Speak up a little bit, sorry.
My mother's family came from Lvov, and the day Hitler came to power, my grandfather said, we're out of here, January 1933, so they were very lucky, and they went to Palestine. And I was born there, and we lived with my grandparents, and it was Polish, Polish, Polish. Now it's the Ukraine, so if I come to Poland to search my heritage, I feel like I'm not really there. I was there in 1990, and we walked around Lvov, and it's a beautiful city. But I feel like I'm sort of cut away from my Polish side now. So if I take this journey, what can I expect in terms of genealogy, in terms of connections, roots, etc.?
So, the genealogists that are working in Poland are generally are working with the idea that Poland today was not Poland of yesterday. So we actually administer at the JCC, we have a proprietary database, a genealogical database, which also includes the whole area around. So when you're dealing with, if you go on a Polish, if you come to Poland and you're accessing genealogists or focusing on that, then the genealogists also focus on Ukraine. So it would be the Polish side would also deal with Lvov, because so many people, my wife's family also from Lvov. It was such a Jewish city and such a Polish city, of course. So it's not an issue like, uh-oh, it's across the border, we can't help you with that.
Thank you. I told you, Joseph, before that I really enjoyed your book. I just also wanted to mention that a few of us here are genealogists, and we're going to Poland this summer. The International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies is having their first annual conference in Eastern Europe in Warsaw. And so I've been to Poland before. I did visit all the towns where my grandparents came from. I spent a month traveling. And I just wanted to say that it was very important to visit these places and the Jewish cemeteries and synagogues that have survived. But I also felt, especially when I went in 2010, that I wanted to see Polish history. And it was so interesting knowing that many towns and buildings were built by Italian architects who went to Poland. It has a rich history, and I encourage people who go, to expand a bit. I went to one of the only surviving mosques in northeastern Poland. It was a very rich, multi-ethnic country. There's so much to see. And also, in terms of genealogy, to also encourage people to use the resources here. And I'm the vice president of the Jewish Genealogical Society in New York, so I want to encourage those of you who are really interested to join the Jewish Genealogical Society in New York. Come to our meetings. We meet here often. So that's enough.
Thank you. By the way, we're very excited.
Just parenthetically, I could be wrong about this, but I think as you get older, your desire to do this, I think, increases because you start to wonder, well, what was my life all about? Who am I? Where do I come from? And doing this kind of trip really it doesn't answer all the questions, but it does enrich your sense of your life. I know I was not at all interested in the Holocaust. My daughter Annie, who's a children's book editor, a young adult book editor at Source Books, also doesn't have that much interest in it. But when you get older, I think you start to wonder, well, who were my parents, and who were where did they come from, and I think this kind of drives you to make this kind of a trip, and I think that's important.
I would just want to pick up on the fact that we're very excited that the International Association is hosting the conference in Warsaw. And we had talked about this before. We were just sitting around kind of schmoozing. We have other people in the room who I've had the privilege of traveling with. And one of the things I think we'd like to stress is, please come. If you're coming for personal reasons or communal reasons or sociological or cultural reasons, it's important to come, and it's important to come now. We talked a little bit, and let's not go into tonight because it's probably getting late, though I have jet lag, so it's fine. Is those of us in Poland, both Jews and non-Jews, who are involved in not only the revival of Jewish life, but in democratic society and civil society, this is the time to come. We are now part of the Jewish Peoplehood Table. We're part of the world. We're part of NATO, EU, and so forth. And so if the hesitation is, should I come now? I think both Jonathan and I are happy to take on those questions. How you should come and where you should go, those are also questions we're really happy to answer.
I think that when you visit, you find, as many people tell us, that you come saying Kaddish and you leave saying Shechianu. Trademark.
I'm a child of Holocaust survivors born in post-war Germany. In fact, you know my sister Ellie Gelman. I met you at one of the bar mitzvahs, and.
She's a friend of my wife's who's sitting right there.
Oh, okay. You're both in the same team,
And a
possibly?
colleague as well.
Okay. Anyway, so I may be the contrarian here in this audience and on stage because when Lauder decided he was going to resuscitate Jewish life in Poland and donate lots of money and put in tons of money into Poland to do this, I was very unhappy and upset about this. And I still believe that all these Jews coming to Poland, making these trips, and I belong to a 2G group, and one of my sons was one of the founders of the 3G group in Manhattan. But I thought, this is just to make money for Poland. Do you think they really care about the Jews? I know you think so, but I think it's a big money raiser for Poland. And personally, I am very much against this. I think this money could be used in so many different ways. And my parents, actually, my father died when I was young, so once upon a time.
Do you have a question?
Yes, my question is, why are you doing this? Why do you think this is so important? Why is this not just a money raiser for Poland? And that's what I think.
Do you have an answer?
Is it concise? Yes. You're in.
I've made several trips back to both Germany and Poland looking for all kinds of things, and without the help of people on the ground there, there's no way I find anything. And especially of non-Jewish people who have helped me everywhere I've gone. And they're all connected through these organizations. So without all that money put into these organizations in the first place, there's no chance that the third generation comes back and finds anything on their own. It's impossible.
Well, maybe I can also, if I can also, why are we putting money in, why is money being put into Poland? There are Jews in Poland. What we think that when we go and we learn about the Holocaust and we go to the camps, we think that all we can do is commemorate and remember and make sure it never happens to us or anyone else again. But there are lost Jews. These are victims of the Holocaust. They're not victims that were in the camps and they weren't murdered and they're not survivors, but there are young people who were cut off from their own identity as Jews. And I think being Jewish means being part of a family. And we have an opportunity that we never thought we would have to actually move the needle, to affect the number of Jews lost to the Jewish world because of the Holocaust and rebuild Jewish life in Poland because there are Jews there. And I think,
20,000.
Excuse me?
20,000.
100,000. Really? And how do we not? And if we have the opportunity to do this, then we have the responsibility to do that. How do we not do that? We just opened a preschool in September, the first Jewish kindergarten to open in Krakow, community kindergarten, in 70 years. The answer is, why should we invest in Poland? It's because there are lost Jews in Poland, and these are victims of the Holocaust and then victims of 50 years of communism, and we can reach out to them and bring them back. And how do we not do that?
By the way, Jonathan, before we take another question, I wanted to ask you about the 100,000 figure, because I wasn't pointing out that you were exaggerating. That's the figure I was given. Are there 100,000?
Well, I should clarify. It's not that you're wrong or that I'm right. It's just we have no idea. We have no idea. We have no idea how many Jews are in Poland today. You have people every day that are finding out they're Jewish. I'll tell you maybe one quick thing about the idea of numbers in Poland. There's a young woman in our community who found out that she was Jewish when she was a teenager. She's in her 20s. She's very involved now. Her mother refers to her mother as being Jewish. So she has a mother that's Jewish, a grandmother. She has a brother. This young woman has a brother, not interested. Her mother has a brother and sister. They all have children. They both have children. In one family, you have 12 people who, according to Jewish law, according to halakha, are Jewish. But you have one that today is identifying as Jewish. I can make a strong case to you that in that family there's one Jew. I can make a probably equally persuasive case in that same family there are 12 Jews. Or we can say maybe a few of them will get involved. So this is the problem today in Poland. The question is how many people at least have some Jewish roots, a Jewish grandparent per se, then that's the higher number. How many are involved today? Of course, much closer to your number.
Okay, we're going to take one more question, and then you can certainly talk with everybody at the reception afterwards.
I'd like to respond to the woman who questioned the propriety of going to Poland. I think we should not paint with too broad a brush. We're not going to Poland. We're going to visit certain people in Poland. When I go to Poland, I don't go to visit the anti-Semites. I go to visit the Jews and the Poles who want Jews there. People who run the Polin Museum, who run the Jewish Historical Institute, who run the JCC, who run the Taube Center, who run the Genealogy Center, who run the shuls. And they actually want a contact with Jews from America. They appreciate it. These are people who are pushing back against this anti-Semitic propaganda that is being heard in Poland more now than it was in recent years. And we should help them. We shouldn't boycott them.
Thank you, Sam.
So I would like to thank our guests tonight for a really interesting discussion. I do want to ask Joe how the air was in his mother's hometown. Was it as nice as she said? Was it as fresh as she said there? I'm sorry? The air in your mother's hometown? Right. Okay. And I'd like to ask you all to join us in the Great Hall for a reception where you can talk more and ask some more questions, as well as if you're interested in buying Joe's book, it will be for sale out there as well. So thank you very much.